You have come here perhaps out of necessity, or perhaps because something deep within you has stirred at the recognition of your own reflection in those words. If you have, then know this. We do not gather merely to celebrate the beauty of feeling deeply or to romanticize what the world calls emotional intelligence. No, we are gathered here to confront the shadow that lurks beneath what modern psychology naively calls heightened sensitivity. When I speak of sensitivity, I do not speak of a gentle soul who simply notices more than others. I speak of a psychic aperture, a doorway through which the unprocessed chaos of the world pours itself without invitation. And that is not always a gift. Sensitivity in its most popularized form is celebrated as enlightenment, yet we must beware of concepts made too palatable by collective consumption. When a thing becomes fashionable, it has usually been stripped of its danger. The sensitive soul, as I have encountered through years of observation, dreams, and archetypal understanding, is not a serene spiritual figure floating above the mundane. No, the truly sensitive person is a carrier of weight they did not choose, a vessel for storms that are not their own, and they are often unaware of the forces that have claimed them as territory. To understand this, we must look beneath the surface, beneath even the psychological explanations, for sensitivity is not merely about having thin skin or being easily moved to tears. It is about being unconsciously vulnerable to currents that most people never perceive. Picture a lighthouse keeper in the midst of a violent storm, their beacon cutting through the darkness, not by choice, but by design. They cannot turn off the light, cannot dim its intensity, cannot control what ships are drawn to their shore. That is sensitivity. It illuminates what others cannot see, but it also attracts what others would rather avoid. And unless the keeper becomes conscious of their function, they are fated to be overwhelmed by every vessel seeking harbour in their light. In one of my most vivid recollections, I worked with a woman who described a recurring dream that haunted her for years. She stood in a vast library where every book was written in a language she could not read, yet somehow she understood every word. The books contained the secrets, fears, and unspoken truths of everyone she had ever encountered. She could not close them, could not look away, could not leave the library. Her body ached with the weight of carrying knowledge that was never meant for her to hold. That woman is sensitivity incarnate. Her gift had become her prison, her awareness her torment. She had no boundaries between what belonged to her consciousness and what belonged to the collective unconscious that spoke through others. There is great peril in being an open channel without the wisdom to direct the flow. You see, the unconscious realm operates without moral consideration. It is a cauldron of raw material, both sacred and chaotic, creative and destructive. When a sensitive person opens themselves to the psychic atmosphere around them, whether intentionally through compassion or involuntarily through energetic permeability, they invite into their being the undigested emotional matter of their environment. Most people walk through life trailing shadows behind them, unprocessed experiences and unfelt feelings that they have refused to acknowledge. That which is unloved in one person seeks refuge in another, and the sensitive individual, if unguarded, becomes that refuge. There is an ancient story I encountered in my studies, one that speaks to this dynamic with startling clarity. A young oracle in a mountain village would walk the edges of the forest each dawn, and there she would hear voices that had no bodies. These voices would pour into her consciousness, not as words but as sensations, sudden waves of longing, terror, rage that was not her own. The oracle began to weep at inappropriate moments, to tremble in stillness, to laugh when silence filled the air. The villagers, recognizing the signs, summoned their elder. The elder did not attempt to silence the voices. Instead, she taught the oracle to distinguish between her own inner voice and the chorus of others. This is the lesson I offer you now. To be sensitive without discernment is to become a playground for disembodied experiences. But to be sensitive with awareness, that is the path of mastery. You may think it sufficient to say, I feel things more deeply than others, but you must venture deeper. Why do you feel what you feel? Where does it enter your consciousness, and what are you doing with the information once it arrives? Because sensitivity can become a subtle form of possession. The unconscious is a master of disguise. It does not always announce itself with obvious symptoms. Sometimes it arrives as intuition so overwhelming that it paralyzes you. Sometimes it manifests as a compulsion to help that destroys your ability to help yourself. Sometimes it appears as attraction to people whose unresolved conflicts have mistaken your psyche for their healing ground. I have witnessed sensitive individuals fall into relationships with the very people who drain their life force, not out of weakness, but because they have been unconsciously seduced by the other person's emotional chaos. They feel the disturbance, and in feeling it, they become the stabilizer, the container, the silent absorber. But there is a dark alchemy in that exchange, what the ancients called the transformation into the opposite. The healer becomes the wounded. The one who brings clarity becomes lost in confusion. And the longer this unconscious pattern continues, the more the sensitive person begins to lose track of where their authentic self ends and their reactive self begins. If you recognize yourself in these words, you must understand that your sensitivity is not merely emotional or psychological. It is energetic and it is archetypal. You are attuned not just to surface feelings, but to the deeper currents that shape human experience itself. When someone enters your presence, it is not merely their mood or demeanor you register. It is their lineage of unhealed wounds, their unlived potential, their relationship with forces they themselves do not understand. And unless you have made contact with your own inner landscape, unless you have traversed the depths of your own psyche and claimed what is yours, you will be swept away by the undertow. There is a seductive quality to this overwhelm that few dare acknowledge. In the spiritual marketplace, sensitivity is often worn as a badge of honor, a sign of evolutionary advancement or divine favor. But in the realm of genuine psychological development, no gift comes without its shadow. All light creates darkness, and sensitivity, perhaps more than any other human capacity, invites shadow material to the surface. Do you know what happens when a person suppresses their authentic power for decades? It does not disappear. It waits in the psychic field, seeking expression through those who are open enough to carry it. And when such a person encounters someone with unguarded sensitivity, that suppressed power leaps across the space between them like electricity seeking ground. The sensitive individual, unprepared for this transmission, may suddenly find themselves feeling grandiose, special, chosen, unaware that they are carrying an energy that does not belong to their authentic nature. Or conversely, they may feel depleted, confused, inadequate, carrying the weight of someone else's disowned inadequacy. The gift of perception becomes a burden of absorption, and the person loses the thread of their own experience in the tangle of psychic material that flows through them without discrimination. I once encountered a man who came to me in a state of complete exhaustion. He was a teacher, beloved by his students, respected by his colleagues, yet he could barely function outside of his professional role. Every interaction left him feeling as though he had been hollowed out from the inside. He described it as being a sponge that had forgotten how to wring itself clean. Through our work together, what emerged was this: he had unconsciously taken on the role of emotional regulator for every classroom he entered. His sensitivity had become a service he provided without awareness, absorbing the anxiety, frustration, and confusion of dozens of young minds daily. He had become invisible to himself, existing only as a function of others' needs. This is the tragedy of unconscious sensitivity, to become so merged with the emotional weather of others that your own inner climate becomes unrecognizable. And yet it happens with alarming frequency in families where the most perceptive child becomes the emotional thermostat for an entire household, in marriages where one partner unconsciously manages the feeling life of the other, in friendships where sensitivity becomes a form of unpaid emotional labor that slowly drains the giver while enabling the receiver to remain unconscious of their own inner world. This dynamic is not accidental, it is archetypal. The sensitive individual without proper boundaries becomes possessed by what I call the eternal caretaker, an ancient pattern that demands suffering as proof of love. When this archetype rises in the psyche unexamined, it convinces the person that their value lies in their capacity to absorb and transform the pain of others. This is not healing, it is a distortion of healing. It is the shadow of the wounded healer complex, where one's identity becomes so intertwined with others' brokenness that wholeness itself becomes threatening. The sensitive soul loses autonomy not through weakness, but because an unconscious force has taken the reins of their psyche. You must understand that archetypes are not metaphors or psychological concepts. They are living patterns of energy, older than consciousness itself, older than human language. When you feel drawn to rescue, when you feel depleted after social interaction, when you feel inflated by being needed, pause and ask yourself, are these truly my feelings, or am I being animated by invisible forces? The archetype of the saviour, the martyr, the eternal mother, even the wounded child, all of these can slip into the unguarded sensitive person and move them like a marionette on strings of unconscious compulsion. But marionettes do not individuate, they perform. To become whole, the sensitive individual must begin the dangerous and sacred work of separation. Not separation from love or compassion, but separation from unconscious fusion. Not withdrawal from connection, but the establishment of energetic sovereignty. This is not coldness, this is clarity. It is warmth with boundaries, presence with protection, openness with discernment. The path forward requires a fundamental shift in understanding. Your sensitivity is not a flaw to be managed or a burden to be endured. Neither is it a spiritual gift that automatically makes you more evolved than others. It is a capacity, like intelligence or creativity, that can be developed consciously or allowed to operate unconsciously. The difference between these two approaches is the difference between mastery and victimhood, between genuine service and unconscious martyrdom. The conscious development of sensitivity begins with a confrontation that most would rather avoid. The recognition that your gift has been contaminated by need. not the pure need for connection or understanding, but the desperate hunger for validation that masquerades as compassion. The sensitive person who has not done this inner work carries within them a secret addiction to being indispensable, to being the one who understands when no one else can, to being chosen by broken souls as their sanctuary. This addiction operates below the threshold of awareness, disguised as noble purpose. It whispers that your suffering has meaning, that your overwhelm is evidence of your depth, that your inability to say no proves your spiritual advancement. But these whispers do not come from your authentic self. They arise from a wounded part of your psyche that learned early that love must be earned through service, that acceptance comes only to those who make themselves useful to others' pain. I recall working with a woman whose sensitivity had become her identity so completely that she could not imagine who she would be without it. She had built her entire sense of self around her ability to feel what others could not express, to know what they could not acknowledge. When I suggested that she might need to create boundaries around this capacity, she looked at me with genuine terror. "But if I'm not helping them," she asked, "who am I?" This question revealed the core wound. She had confused her essence with her function, her being with her doing. This confusion is not uncommon among those who discover their sensitivity in childhood through trauma or instability. The child who learns to read the emotional temperature of their household in order to survive develops a hypervigilance that they later mistake for intuition. The young person who becomes the family's emotional mediator learns to value themselves based on their ability to absorb and neutralize conflict. What begins as an adaptive strategy becomes a compulsive pattern that follows them into every relationship, every workplace, every social interaction. But here lies the deeper mystery. Why do certain souls seem destined to carry this particular burden? Why do some children naturally attune themselves to the unspoken while others remain blissfully unaware? The answer, I believe, lies not in personal psychology alone, but in something far more ancient and purposeful. The sensitive individual often carries within their lineage a legacy of unfinished emotional business, ancestral patterns that seek resolution through a descendant willing to feel what previous generations could not. There are bloodlines marked by silence, families where truth was too dangerous to speak, where feelings were buried so deep they fossilized into symptoms that appeared generations later. The sensitive child born into such a lineage does not choose their gift. They inherit it as both blessing and burden, a psychic inheritance that connects them to the unlived lives of their ancestors. I have worked with individuals whose sensitivity could be traced back through generations of women who were forbidden to express anger, men who were punished for showing vulnerability, children who learned that their survival depended on their ability to disappear into the needs of others. These patterns pass down through the invisible threads that connect soul to soul across time, manifest in the present as an almost compulsive need to feel for others what they cannot feel for themselves. The tragedy is that this ancestral sensitivity, when unconscious, becomes a form of repetition rather than resolution. Instead of breaking the cycle of emotional suppression, the sensitive descendant perpetuates it by absorbing what others refuse to process. They become the repository for feelings that span generations, carrying grief that belongs to the dead, anger that was never expressed, love that was never received. This is why the path of conscious sensitivity requires not just personal healing, but ancestral healing. The individual must learn to distinguish between their own authentic emotional responses and the ghostly echoes of their lineage. They must develop the capacity to honor their inheritance without being enslaved by it, to feel the pain of their ancestors without taking responsibility for healing it. The dreams of such individuals often reveal this dynamic in symbolic form. They find themselves in houses that belong to relatives they have never met, carrying suitcases filled with objects they do not recognize, speaking languages they have never learned. These are not personal symbols but ancestral ones, images that emerge from the collective unconscious of their family system to show them what they carry that is not their own. But the ancestral dimension is only one layer of the mystery. There is also the collective dimension, the way sensitive individuals unconsciously attune themselves to the broader currents of human suffering that flow through our shared psychic atmosphere. In an age of global communication and collective trauma, the sensitive person can find themselves overwhelmed not just by personal or familial material, but by the pain of strangers, the anxiety of cultures, the grief of species. I have encountered individuals who cannot watch the news without feeling physically ill, who avoid crowded places because they absorb the collective mood, who find themselves weeping for reasons they cannot name. These are not symptoms of mental illness, but signs of psychic porosity, an inability to distinguish between personal and collective emotional content. The modern world, with its constant stream of information about distant tragedies and global crises, can overwhelm the sensitive psyche in ways that previous generations never had to navigate. The person who feels deeply may find themselves carrying the weight of the world literally, their nervous system responding to events happening thousands of miles away as if they were occurring in their own living room. This collective sensitivity requires a different kind of boundary work, one that acknowledges the interconnectedness of all suffering while maintaining the integrity of the individual psyche. It demands the development of what I call discerning compassion, the ability to witness pain without absorbing it, to care without carrying, to feel without drowning. The key to this discernment lies in understanding that not all pain seeks healing. Some suffering is sacred to its bearer, necessary for their growth, essential to their path. To interfere with such suffering, even from the most loving intentions, is to violate the soul's wisdom. The sensitive person who rushes to soothe every discomfort they perceive may actually be preventing the very growth that the discomfort is meant to catalyze. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson for the unconscious sensitive to learn, that their gift is not a mandate to fix everything they perceive as broken. The world is full of people who are exactly where they need to be in their journey, even if that place appears painful or chaotic to the observer. The sensitive individual who cannot tolerate others' discomfort often projects their own need for harmony onto situations that require discord for transformation to occur. True sensitivity, when conscious, becomes a form of witnessing that serves not by intervening, but by seeing. It offers presence without intrusion, understanding without judgment, compassion without compulsion. This kind of sensitivity does not drain the bearer because it does not require them to take on what they observe. Instead, it allows them to serve as a mirror, reflecting back to others their own inner truth without distortion. But reaching this level of conscious sensitivity requires what the alchemists called the great work, the systematic transformation of the unconscious into the conscious, the personal into the transpersonal, the reactive into the responsive. It demands that the sensitive individual descend into their own underworld, face their own shadows, and reclaim the parts of themselves they have given away in service to others' needs. This descent is not comfortable. It requires the person to sit with their own pain instead of fleeing into others' problems, to feel their own emptiness instead of filling it with others' needs, to confront their own darkness instead of focusing on the light they bring to others. It asks them to become intimate with the very experiences they have spent their lives avoiding through their compulsive caretaking. The irony is profound. The person who has devoted their life to feeling for others must learn to feel for themselves. The one who has made their sensitivity available to everyone must learn to make it available to their own inner experience. This is not selfishness. It is the foundation of authentic service. For how can one truly help another navigate their emotional landscape if they have never fully explored their own? The journey into one's own emotional terrain is treacherous precisely because it has been so long avoided. The sensitive individual who has spent years, perhaps decades, serving as an emotional translator for others often discovers that they speak a foreign language when it comes to their own inner world. They can name the subtle variations in another's anxiety, detect the hidden grief beneath someone's anger, sense the fear that masquerades as control. Yet when asked to describe their own authentic feelings, they find themselves strangely mute. This muteness is not accidental. It is the result of systematic abandonment. Every time the sensitive person chose to attune to another's emotional state instead of their own, they practiced a form of self-betrayal. Every moment they spent absorbing someone else's discomfort rather than sitting with their own, they strengthened the neural pathways of avoidance. What began as survival strategy crystallized into character structure until the very gift that once protected them became the prison that confined them. I recall a conversation with a musician whose sensitivity had made him exquisitely attuned to the emotional needs of his audiences, but completely disconnected from his own artistic vision. He could feel what every crowd wanted to hear, could sense the exact moment when their attention began to wane, could adjust his performance to maintain their engagement with surgical precision. Yet when I asked him what music moved his own soul, he stared at me with the blank expression of someone who had forgotten they had a soul to be moved. This is the peculiar blindness of unconscious sensitivity, the ability to see everything except oneself. The sensitive individual becomes like a lighthouse whose beam illuminates every ship at sea while leaving its own foundation in darkness. They develop an almost supernatural capacity to read the psychic weather of others while remaining completely unconscious of their own inner climate. But the foundation cannot remain in darkness indefinitely. The psyche demands balance, and what is repressed in consciousness emerges in symptoms. The overgiving sensitive person may find themselves suddenly overwhelmed by inexplicable rage, consumed by bitter resentment toward the very people they have spent years serving. The perpetual helper may discover a cruel voice within themselves that judges others for their neediness while simultaneously feeling guilty for having such thoughts. These shadow eruptions are not signs of moral failure. They are the psyche's attempt to restore equilibrium. The anger is often righteous, pointing toward years of boundary violations that went unacknowledged. The resentment may be highlighting a pattern of one-sided relationships that masqueraded as love. The judgment might be revealing how the person's own needs were sacrificed on the altar of others' comfort. Yet these shadow manifestations, while necessary, are not sufficient for transformation. They serve as wake-up calls, but awakening requires conscious choice. The sensitive individual must decide whether to continue the familiar pattern of self-abandonment disguised as service or to embark upon the more difficult path of reclaiming their own emotional sovereignty. This reclamation begins with a radical act, learning to feel your own feelings first. Not exclusively, not permanently, but first. Before you absorb the anxiety of the person sitting across from you, notice what you are feeling in your own body. Before you rush to soothe someone's distress, pause and ask what your own soul needs in this moment. Before you offer your energy as a solution to another's problem, check whether you have enough energy to sustain yourself. This practice sounds simple, but for the unconscious sensitive, it feels like betrayal. They have been conditioned to believe that self-attention is selfishness, that personal needs are obstacles to love, that authentic feelings are luxuries they cannot afford. The voice that whispers these lies is not their own. It belongs to the wounded child within them who learned that survival depended on being useful to others' pain. That child made a bargain with life. I will feel what you cannot feel, carry what you cannot carry, be what you need me to be, if only you will not abandon me. This bargain seemed reasonable at the time, perhaps even noble. But bargains made from desperation rarely serve the soul's deeper purposes. They create patterns of relating that may ensure survival but prevent thriving. The adult sensitive person must learn to renegotiate this ancient contract. They must find the courage to disappoint others' expectations in service of their own authenticity. This does not mean becoming callous or indifferent. It means developing what I call fierce compassion, love that refuses to enable others' unconsciousness, even when that enabling would be easier. Fierce compassion says, I will not absorb your anger so that you can avoid feeling it. I will not carry your grief so that you can pretend it does not exist. I will not become smaller so that you can avoid growing larger. I will love you enough to let you have your own experience, even if that experience includes pain. This kind of love is more challenging than the unconscious absorption that masquerades as empathy. It requires the sensitive person to tolerate others' discomfort without rushing to fix it, to witness others' struggles without taking responsibility for resolving them. It demands a level of emotional maturity that can only be developed through direct confrontation with one's own inner landscape. The journey inward reveals territories that the sensitive person has spent their life avoiding through their focus on others. There they encounter their own unexpressed anger, their own ungrieved losses, their own unlived dreams. They discover parts of themselves that are selfish, demanding, unreasonable, human. They find the places where they too are broken, where they too need healing, where they too long to be seen and understood. This discovery can be shocking for someone who has defined themselves through their capacity to give. They may feel like frauds, as if their entire identity has been built on a lie. The helper needs help. The healer is wounded. The one who sees clearly has been blind to their own condition. This is not hypocrisy, it is humanity. It is the recognition that we are all walking each other home, all carrying both light and shadow, all struggling to make sense of the mystery of existence. But this recognition, while humbling, is also liberating. It frees the sensitive person from the impossible burden of perfection, from the exhausting performance of having it all together, from the lonely isolation of being the one who gives but never receives. It opens the door to genuine intimacy, relationships based on mutual recognition rather than one-sided service. The process of reclaiming authentic sensitivity often involves a period of what appears to be selfishness. The person who has spent years overgiving may swing to the opposite extreme, becoming protective of their energy to the point of seeming cold or distant. This is not the final destination, but a necessary way station on the journey toward balance. Like a pendulum that has been held to one side for too long, the psyche often swings dramatically in the opposite direction before finding its natural center. The overgiver becomes temporarily undergiving. The people pleaser discovers their capacity for disappointing others. The one who always said yes learns the power of no. This phase can be unsettling for everyone involved. Friends and family members who have grown accustomed to the sensitive person's unlimited availability may feel confused, hurt, or even angry when boundaries suddenly appear. They may accuse the person of changing, of becoming selfish, of losing their caring nature. These accusations can trigger intense guilt in someone who has built their identity around being helpful and available. But this guilt, while painful, is often a sign that the work is proceeding correctly. It indicates that old patterns are being disrupted, that unconscious contracts are being renegotiated, that the person is choosing their own development over others' comfort. The guilt is not a signal to retreat back into familiar patterns of self-abandonment. It is evidence that real change is occurring. The sensitive individual must learn to tolerate this guilt without being controlled by it. They must develop the capacity to disappoint others in service of their own growth, to be misunderstood in service of their own truth, to be accused of selfishness while they learn the difference between healthy self-care and pathological self-sacrifice. This learning process is complicated by the fact that the culture often reinforces the very patterns that drain sensitive individuals. We celebrate the mother who exhausts herself caring for everyone else's needs. We admire the friend who is always available for crisis support. We praise the colleague who stays late to help others with their projects. These behaviors are seen as virtuous, noble, evidence of good character. But what appears virtuous on the surface may be compulsive underneath. The mother who cannot rest while others have needs may be avoiding her own inner emptiness. The perpetually available friend may be using others' crises to distract from their own unresolved issues. The helpful colleague may be purchasing acceptance through service because they do not believe they are worthy of love simply for being themselves. The culture's celebration of these patterns makes it difficult for sensitive individuals to recognize when their giving has become compulsive rather than conscious. They receive positive reinforcement for behaviors that may be slowly destroying their vitality, making it challenging to step back and assess whether their sensitivity is serving their highest good or enabling their deepest wounds. This is why the journey toward conscious sensitivity often requires a period of withdrawal from the very people and situations that have defined the person's identity. The chronic helper may need to step back from helping. The emotional supporter may need to become temporarily unavailable for others' emotional needs. The sensitive friend may need to limit their exposure to others' problems while they develop their capacity to feel their own. This withdrawal is not permanent isolation, it is strategic retreat. Like a warrior who pulls back from battle to tend their wounds and sharpen their weapons, the sensitive individual must sometimes distance themselves from the demands of others in order to reconnect with their own inner resources. During this retreat, they may discover aspects of themselves that have been dormant for years. They might find that they have creative gifts that were never developed because all their energy went to managing others' emotions. They may realize they have opinions and preferences that were never expressed because they were too busy accommodating others' needs. They might uncover dreams and desires that were buried beneath layers of obligation and responsibility. The emergence of these dormant aspects can feel both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because it represents a return to authenticity, a reclamation of lost parts of the self. Terrifying because it threatens the familiar identity that has provided a sense of purpose and meaning, even if that purpose was ultimately destructive. The sensitive person must learn to tolerate this terror without retreating back into the safety of overgiving. They must develop faith that their authentic self is worthy of love, even if that self is less convenient for others than the accommodating persona they have presented. They must trust that relationships based on genuine mutual recognition are more satisfying than those built on one-sided service. This trust does not develop overnight. It requires repeated experiences of being loved for who they are rather than what they do, of being valued for their authentic presence rather than their helpful performance. It demands the courage to show up as themselves, complete with needs and limitations, and discover that they are still worthy of connection. Some relationships will not survive this transformation. People who were drawn to the sensitive individual's unlimited availability may lose interest when boundaries appear. Those who relied on the person's absorption of their emotional chaos may seek other sources of relief when that service is no longer provided. This loss can be painful, but it is also clarifying. It reveals which connections were based on genuine care and which were essentially utilitarian. The relationships that do survive this transformation often become deeper and more authentic. When the sensitive person learns to show up as themselves rather than as a function, they invite others to do the same. The dynamic shifts from helper and help to mutual recognition, from one person giving and another receiving, to both individuals offering their authentic presence to the relationship. This shift requires both parties to develop new skills. The sensitive person must learn to receive as well as give, to express their needs as well as meet others' needs, to be vulnerable about their own struggles rather than focusing exclusively on others' problems. Their partners, friends, and family members must learn to relate to them as a whole person rather than as a resource, to offer support as well as seek it, to see the sensitive individual's humanity rather than just their helpfulness. The process is not always smooth. There may be periods of awkwardness as everyone adjusts to new ways of relating. There may be conflicts as boundaries are established and old patterns are challenged. There may be moments of doubt when it seems easier to return to familiar roles than to navigate the uncertainty of authentic connection. But for those willing to persist through this discomfort, something remarkable emerges: relationships based on truth rather than need, connections that nourish rather than drain, love that empowers rather than diminishes. The sensitive person discovers that they can care deeply without carrying everything, that they can love without losing themselves, that they can serve from fullness rather than emptiness. This transformation does not eliminate sensitivity, it refines it. The person still feels deeply, still perceives subtleties that others miss, still has the capacity to offer profound understanding and support. But now these gifts arise from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than woundedness, from love rather than fear. The conscious, sensitive individual becomes like a skilled musician who can play their instrument with both power and precision. They know when to open and when to close, when to give and when to receive, when to feel deeply and when to maintain protective distance. Their sensitivity becomes a tool they wield, rather than a force that wields them. This mastery does not arrive through intellectual understanding alone. It emerges from the crucible of lived experience, from countless moments of choosing consciousness over compulsion, awareness over absorption. The path demands that the sensitive individual develop what I call energetic literacy, the ability to read the subtle currents that flow between people without being swept away by them. Energetic literacy begins with recognizing that every human encounter involves an exchange that goes far deeper than words or actions. When two people meet, their psychic fields interpenetrate, creating a space where unspoken material can transfer from one consciousness to another. The untrained sensitive person experiences this as an overwhelming flood of impressions, emotions, and sensations that seem to come from nowhere. They may walk away from a conversation feeling inexplicably heavy, anxious, or depleted without understanding what occurred. But the conscious sensitive learns to track these exchanges with the precision of a scientist studying particle interactions. They develop the capacity to notice when their energy field is being entered by foreign material, to distinguish between their own authentic responses and the psychic residue of others. They learn to identify the moment when absorption begins and to make different choices in that crucial instant. I worked with a physician whose sensitivity had become both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. In the examination room, he could sense illness before it manifested physically, could detect emotional distress that patients could not articulate, could perceive the subtle ways that family dynamics affected individual health. This gift made him an extraordinary healer, beloved by patients who felt truly seen in his presence. Yet this same sensitivity nearly destroyed him. He would return home each evening carrying the accumulated suffering of everyone he had encountered, his nervous system overwhelmed by waves of anxiety, pain, and despair that belonged to others. He began to dread going to work, to avoid social situations, to isolate himself in an attempt to escape the constant bombardment of psychic material. Tick. Through our exploration, he discovered that his sensitivity had become unconscious absorption, a pattern established in childhood when he learned to monitor his alcoholic father's moods to predict and prevent explosive episodes. What began as survival strategy had evolved into professional gift, but the underlying mechanism remained unchanged. He was still that hypervigilant child, scanning his environment for emotional disturbance and unconsciously taking responsibility for managing what he found. The transformation required him to develop new neural pathways, new ways of relating to the psychic information he received. Instead of automatically absorbing what he perceived, he learned to witness it with compassionate detachment. He practiced maintaining his energetic boundaries while remaining emotionally available, offering presence without sacrificing his own stability. This shift transformed not only his personal experience, but his effectiveness as a healer. When he stopped absorbing his patients' suffering, he could see their situations more clearly, offer more objective guidance, provide the kind of steady presence that allows others to find their own strength. His sensitivity became a precise instrument rather than a blunt force, serving both himself and others with greater skill. The development of such precision requires understanding that sensitivity operates across multiple dimensions simultaneously. There is emotional sensitivity, the capacity to perceive and respond to feeling states. There is energetic sensitivity, awareness of the subtle forces that flow between people and through environments. There is psychic sensitivity, the ability to access information through non-ordinary means. And there is spiritual sensitivity, attunement to the deeper currents of meaning and purpose that guide human experience. Most people who identify as sensitive are primarily aware of the emotional dimension, experiencing themselves as more reactive to others' moods, more easily moved by beauty or suffering, more affected by the emotional climate around them. But the truly sensitive individual operates across all these dimensions, receiving information through channels that most people never develop or acknowledge. The challenge lies in learning to work with each dimension consciously rather than being overwhelmed by their combined input. The person who is sensitive across multiple levels may find themselves flooded with impressions, intuitions, and energetic information that they lack the framework to process or integrate. They may feel like they are drowning in a sea of subtle perceptions, unable to distinguish between what is personally relevant and what is simply part of the background noise of human consciousness. Developing multidimensional sensitivity requires what the mystics called discrimination, the ability to sort valuable perception from psychic static. Not every impression that enters awareness deserves attention. Not every intuitive flash contains useful information. Not every energetic shift requires response. The conscious sensitive must develop filters, criteria for determining which perceptions warrant investigation and which should be allowed to pass through awareness without engagement. This discrimination emerges through practice and reflection. The individual learns to track which impressions prove accurate and meaningful over time, which types of psychic information serve their highest good, which energetic exchanges leave them feeling nourished versus depleted. They develop an internal compass that can navigate the complex landscape of subtle perception with increasing skill and confidence. I recall working with an artist whose multidimensional sensitivity had become a source of creative inspiration and personal torment. She could walk into any space and immediately sense its history, the emotional imprints left by previous occupants, the way past events had shaped the psychic atmosphere. This gift informed her work in profound ways, allowing her to create pieces that captured invisible truths about place and memory. But the same sensitivity made ordinary life nearly impossible. She could not enter stores without being overwhelmed by the collective emotional residue of thousands of shoppers. She could not attend social gatherings without absorbing the unspoken tensions and hidden wounds of everyone present. She lived in a constant state of psychic overwhelm, her nervous system perpetually activated by stimuli that others could not perceive. Her healing journey involved learning to modulate her sensitivity like adjusting the volume on a radio. She discovered that she could choose when to open fully to psychic information and when to maintain protective boundaries. She learned to create energetic shields that allowed her to function in crowded or chaotic environments without losing her essential gift. Most importantly, she developed rituals for clearing and cleansing her energy field after exposure to psychically dense situations. Like a surgeon who scrubs thoroughly after operating, she learned to wash away psychic residue through movement, meditation, time in nature, and conscious breathing practices. These rituals allowed her to maintain her sensitivity while protecting her well-being. The metaphor of the surgeon is particularly apt because it illustrates how professional boundaries can coexist with profound caring. The skilled surgeon maintains emotional connection with their patient while preserving the detachment necessary for precise intervention. They care deeply about the outcome while remaining unattached to factors beyond their control. They offer their skill and presence without taking personal responsibility for results that depend on forces larger than their individual will. The conscious sensitive must develop similar professional boundaries around their gift, even when using it in personal relationships. They must learn to care without carrying, to feel without absorbing, to offer insight without taking responsibility for whether that insight is received or acted upon. This requires a fundamental shift from seeing sensitivity as a burden they must bear to understanding it as a service they choose to offer. This shift transforms the entire experience of being sensitive. Instead of feeling victimized by their gift, the person begins to see it as a form of sacred work. Instead of resenting their unusual perceptiveness, they recognize it as a calling to serve human consciousness in unique ways. Instead of trying to shut down their sensitivity to avoid overwhelm, they learn to refine and direct it with intention and skill. The development of conscious sensitivity often reveals that what seemed like personal affliction was actually preparation for transpersonal service. Many individuals who suffer through years of uncontrolled psychic absorption discover that their struggles were training them for work that requires unusual depth of perception and compassion. Their wounds become their qualifications, their sensitivity becomes their expertise. But this transformation from wounded sensitive to conscious servant requires integration of the shadow material that accumulates through years of unconscious absorption. The person who has spent decades taking on others' emotional burdens carries within their psyche a repository of unlived experiences, unprocessed traumas, and unintegrated aspects that belong to the collective rather than the individual. This psychic material does not simply disappear when the person develops boundaries. It must be sorted, processed, and either integrated or released through conscious therapeutic work. The individual may need to grieve losses that were never theirs, express anger that belonged to others, or complete emotional processes that were interrupted by premature absorption of external material. This clearing work can be intense and disorienting. As the person begins to separate their authentic feelings from the psychic debris they have carried, they may go through periods of emotional volatility, confusion about their identity, or uncertainty about what they actually want versus what they have been conditioned to want by their absorption of others' desires. I worked with a woman who had spent her entire adult life married to a man whose emotional needs she absorbed so completely that she lost track of her own preferences. She dressed the way he liked, ate foods he preferred, chose entertainment that matched his interests, all while believing these were her own choices. It was only when she began to develop energetic boundaries that she realized how thoroughly she had disappeared into his psychic field. The process of reclaiming her authentic preferences was like archaeological excavation, carefully brushing away layers of accumulated otherness to discover what lay beneath. She had to experiment with different styles, foods, activities, and forms of expression to rediscover her own aesthetic sensibilities. She had to sit with uncertainty about her desires while her authentic preferences slowly emerged from beneath decades of unconscious absorption. This reclamation process revealed not only what she had given away, but what she had been avoiding in herself. Her sensitivity had served as a convenient escape from her own difficult emotions, her own complex inner landscape, her own responsibility for creating a meaningful life. By focusing on others' needs, she had avoided confronting her own fears, limitations, and unfulfilled dreams. The conscious development of sensitivity requires facing these avoided territories with the same courage and compassion that the person has shown to others. They must become as patient with their own emotional complexity as they have been with others' struggles, as forgiving of their own mistakes as they have been of others' failures, as committed to their own growth as they have been to others' healing. This inner work often reveals that the sensitive person's gift is not separate from their wounds, but intimately connected to them. The capacity to feel deeply for others often emerges from early experiences of not being seen or understood themselves. The ability to perceive others' hidden pain frequently develops from familiarity with their own hidden suffering. The drive to heal others commonly arises from a deep longing to heal themselves. Recognizing these connections does not diminish the value of the sensitive person's gifts. Instead, it reveals their gifts as expressions of their humanity rather than evidence of their specialness. It shows that their capacity to serve others emerges not from superior spiritual development, but from shared vulnerability, common struggle, universal longing for connection and understanding. This recognition can be both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it strips away the subtle superiority that sometimes accompanies identifying as sensitive or spiritually gifted. Liberating because it frees the person from the burden of being different, special, or chosen for a role they never consciously accepted. The mature, sensitive individual no longer sees their gift as setting them apart from others, but as connecting them more deeply to the shared human experience. They recognize that everyone carries sensitivity within them, though it may be expressed or developed differently. They understand that their role is not to be the designated feeler for their community, but to model conscious feeling, to demonstrate that it is possible to be open-hearted without being overwhelmed. This modeling happens not through teaching or preaching, but through embodiment. When others witness someone who can feel deeply while remaining centered, who can care profoundly while maintaining boundaries, who can be sensitive without being fragile, they begin to believe that such integration is possible for themselves as well. The conscious sensitive becomes a living demonstration that the seeming opposites of openness and strength, vulnerability and power, caring and detachment can be held simultaneously. They show that sensitivity need not mean fragility, that depth need not mean darkness, that feeling deeply need not mean suffering constantly. This integration represents a new form of human consciousness, one that bridges ancient wisdom about the interconnectedness of all life with modern understanding of individual psychological health. It suggests that the next stage of human development may involve learning to be both deeply connected and appropriately boundaried, both empathically attuned and energetically sovereign. The sensitive individuals who undertake this conscious development are pioneers in this evolutionary process. Their willingness to face the shadow of unconscious absorption, to reclaim their authentic selves from the tangle of others' projections, to transform their gift from burden to blessing, serves not only their own healing, but the healing of human consciousness itself. For in learning to feel without drowning, to care without carrying, to serve without sacrificing themselves, they point toward possibilities that extend far beyond their individual lives. They suggest that it may be possible to create a world where sensitivity is honored without being exploited, where depth is valued without being pathologized, where the gifts of the heart can flourish without the sacrifice of the soul. This vision requires not only individual transformation, but collective recognition that sensitivity is not weakness but strength, not liability but asset, not problem but solution to many of the challenges facing human civilization. It demands cultures that support rather than exploit sensitive individuals, institutions that value emotional intelligence alongside other forms of intelligence, relationships that nourish rather than drain those who feel deeply. The conscious sensitive individual becomes an agent of this cultural transformation, not through activism or advocacy, but through the quiet revolution of living differently. By refusing to abandon themselves in service to others, they challenge systems that depend on such abandonment. By insisting on their right to feel without absorbing, they question dynamics that require emotional martyrdom. By demonstrating that caring can coexist with boundaries, they offer an alternative to the false choice between connection and autonomy. This quiet revolution spreads through example rather than argument, through inspiration rather than confrontation. As more sensitive individuals reclaim their gifts from the distortions of unconscious absorption, they create ripple effects that touch everyone around them. Their partners learn to take responsibility for their own emotions. Their children grow up knowing that feelings can be honored without being overwhelming. Their communities discover new models of mutual support that do not require anyone to disappear in service to others. The transformation of sensitivity from unconscious absorption to conscious service represents more than personal healing. It points toward the emergence of a new form of human relating, one based on recognition rather than projection, presence rather than performance, authentic connection rather than codependent fusion. This emergence is not guaranteed. It requires individuals willing to undertake the difficult work of conscious development, to face their shadows and reclaim their light, to risk disapproval in service of authenticity. It demands communities willing to support rather than exploit sensitive gifts, to value emotional wisdom alongside other forms of intelligence, to create spaces where depth can flourish without requiring martyrdom. But for those willing to undertake this work, the rewards extend far beyond personal well-being. They discover that conscious sensitivity is not just a gift to be managed, but a doorway to be entered, leading to dimensions of experience and service that unconscious absorption could never access. They find that their refined sensitivity becomes a bridge between worlds, a translator between different levels of human experience, a beacon that guides others toward their own authentic depth. In learning to honor their sensitivity without being enslaved by it, they discover that they have not lost their gift, but transformed it into something far more powerful: the capacity to serve life itself through the conscious expression of their deepest nature. And in that service, they find not only healing for themselves, but hope for a world that desperately needs the gifts that conscious sensitivity can offer. The path I have described is not theoretical. It is carved from the bones of lived experience, marked by the footprints of those who have walked it before you. But knowing the path and walking it are different territories entirely. The conscious development of sensitivity requires not just understanding, but embodiment, not just insight, but integration, not just recognition, but radical transformation of how you move through the world. There comes a moment in this journey when the sensitive individual must make a choice that will determine whether they spend their remaining years as unconscious servants to others' chaos or as sovereign beings who offer their gifts from fullness rather than emptiness. This choice cannot be made from the mind alone. It must be carved into the flesh of daily experience, practiced in the crucible of relationship, tested against the resistance of old patterns that would rather die than change. I have witnessed this moment of choice countless times. It arrives differently for each person, but it always carries the same essential quality: the recognition that continuing on the old path leads only to deeper dissolution, while the new path, though uncertain, offers the possibility of reclaiming what has been lost. For some, it comes as a breakdown so complete that the old identity can no longer be maintained. For others, it emerges as a quiet knowing that whispers from the depths, "There must be another way." The woman I mentioned earlier, who discovered her own preferences buried beneath decades of absorption, described this moment with startling clarity. She was sitting in her kitchen, preparing her husband's favorite meal for what felt like the 1,000th time, when she suddenly stopped moving. Not from fatigue or distraction, but from a recognition so profound it seemed to halt time itself. She realized she could not remember the last time she had eaten something simply because she wanted it, worn something because it pleased her, or chosen an activity based on her own desire rather than someone else's need. In that moment of recognition, she faced a choice that terrified her. She could continue preparing the meal, serving it with a smile, maintaining the fiction that these were her preferences too, or she could set down the spoon and begin the long journey back to herself. The choice seemed simple, but its implications were staggering. To choose herself meant risking the disapproval of everyone who had grown comfortable with her self-effacement. It meant confronting the possibility that she might be unloved if she stopped being useful. It meant entering the unknown territory of her own authentic desires. She chose herself. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with the quiet courage of setting down the spoon and walking away from the stove. That single act of choosing her own truth over others' comfort became the first step in a transformation that would reshape every aspect of her existence. This is how conscious sensitivity begins, with micro choices that seem insignificant but carry the weight of entire lifetimes. The choice to notice your own fatigue before attending to someone else's distress. The choice to speak your truth even when it disappoints. The choice to leave a conversation that drains you rather than enduring it out of politeness. Each choice creates a small crack in the prison of unconscious absorption and through those cracks, authentic selfhood begins to emerge. But emergence is not comfortable. The sensitive individual who begins to reclaim their sovereignty will encounter resistance not only from others who benefited from their self-abandonment, but from the parts of themselves that learned to equate love with sacrifice. There will be moments when the old patterns seem easier, when unconscious absorption feels safer than conscious choice, when the familiar pain of self-betrayal seems preferable to the uncertain territory of authentic living. I have seen people turn back at this threshold, frightened by the intensity of their own aliveness when it is no longer filtered through others' needs. They retreat into familiar roles, convincing themselves that their brief taste of freedom was selfishness, that their moment of choosing themselves was evidence of moral failure. The pull toward unconscious absorption can be seductive precisely because it offers the illusion of virtue while avoiding the responsibility of authentic existence. But for those who persist through this resistance, who continue choosing consciousness even when it feels like betrayal, something miraculous begins to unfold. The energy that was once scattered across dozens of others' emotional landscapes begins to consolidate around their own center. The awareness that was fragmented by constant external focus begins to integrate into coherent self-knowledge. The love that was given away indiscriminately begins to flow from a source that cannot be depleted because it is connected to something larger than individual capacity. This consolidation does not happen overnight. It requires what the alchemists called the slow work, the patient transformation of base material into gold through sustained attention and conscious intention. The sensitive individual must learn to sit with their own discomfort without immediately seeking distraction in others' problems. They must develop tolerance for their own complexity without rushing to simplify it through external focus. They must discover their own rhythm without constantly adjusting it to match others' needs. In this process, they often discover that their sensitivity was not just about feeling, but about a fundamental way of processing reality that extends far beyond emotion. They begin to notice subtleties in their environment that have nothing to do with other people's feelings. The way light changes quality throughout the day, the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure that precede weather changes, the complex interplay of colors, sounds, and textures that create the fabric of lived experience. This expanded awareness reveals that sensitivity is not a burden to be managed, but a capacity to be celebrated. When freed from the compulsive focus on others' emotional states, the sensitive individual discovers they have access to a richer, more nuanced experience of reality than they ever imagined. They find themselves moved by beauty that others overlook, inspired by connections that others miss, nourished by subtleties that others cannot perceive. The artist I mentioned, who learned to modulate her psychic sensitivity, described this transformation as moving from black and white television to full-color high definition. The world did not change, but her capacity to perceive its complexity and beauty expanded exponentially once she was no longer overwhelmed by psychic static. She could finally appreciate the symphony of existence because she was no longer drowning in the cacophony of unprocessed collective emotion. This expansion of awareness often coincides with the emergence of what I call authentic service. When the sensitive individual is no longer compulsively absorbing others' pain, they discover they have something far more valuable to offer, the gift of clear seeing. No longer clouded by the projections and expectations of those around them, They can perceive situations with remarkable clarity, offering insights that cut through confusion and illumination that dispels darkness. But this authentic service feels entirely different from the unconscious absorption that preceded it. It arises from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from love rather than fear. The conscious sensitive can offer profound support to others precisely because they are not dependent on others' approval or gratitude for their sense of worth. They can speak difficult truths because they are not afraid of being rejected. They can hold space for others' pain because they are not trying to fix or absorb it. This transformation creates what mystics have called the paradox of service. The more centered the individual becomes in their own truth, the more capable they become of genuine service to others. The more they protect their own energy, the more energy they have available for conscious offering. The more they honor their own boundaries, the more present they can be within those boundaries. I witnessed this paradox most clearly in the physician whose story I shared earlier. As he learned to maintain energetic boundaries while remaining emotionally available, his effectiveness as a healer increased dramatically. Patients sensed his presence more deeply because he was actually present rather than fragmented by absorption. His insights became more accurate because they arose from clarity rather than confusion. His compassion became more powerful because it flowed from strength rather than depletion. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. Where once he had seemed perpetually overwhelmed, always rushing from one crisis to another, he now moved with deliberate presence. Where once his care had felt desperate, as if he were personally responsible for every patient's outcome, he now offered skillful attention without attachment to results beyond his control. Where once he had burned out regularly, requiring frequent breaks to recover from emotional exhaustion, he now found his work energizing rather than draining. The patients noticed too. They began to describe feeling more seen, more understood, more supported in his presence. Paradoxically, by learning to maintain his own center while caring for others, he became a more effective healer than he had ever been when he absorbed their suffering as his own. His boundaries did not create distance. They created the safety that allowed for deeper intimacy. His self-care did not make him selfish. It made him more capable of selfless service. This paradox challenges everything our culture teaches about caring and service. We are conditioned to believe that love requires sacrifice, that caring means carrying, that service demands self-abandonment. But conscious sensitivity reveals these beliefs as distortions that serve no one's highest good. True love creates space for the beloved to exist authentically. Genuine care supports others' capacity to carry their own experience. Authentic service emerges from wholeness rather than brokenness. The sensitive individual who embodies this understanding becomes a revolutionary presence in a world addicted to codependence. They demonstrate that it is possible to care deeply without carrying everything, to love profoundly without losing oneself, to serve powerfully without sacrificing one's essence. Their very existence challenges systems that depend on unconscious absorption and emotional martyrdom. This challenge is not always welcomed. There are individuals, families, institutions, and even entire cultures that have organized themselves around the availability of unconscious sensitives to absorb collective shadow material. When such a person begins to develop conscious boundaries, it can trigger intense resistance from those who have benefited from their previous self-abandonment. The sensitive individual may be accused of becoming cold, selfish, or uncaring. They may be told they have lost their gift, betrayed their calling, or abandoned their spiritual path. These accusations can be particularly painful because they often come from people the sensitive person loves, people they have served faithfully for years or even decades. But these accusations reveal more about the accusers than about the accused. They expose the ways in which others have become dependent on the sensitive person's unconscious absorption, the ways in which they have avoided their own emotional development by relying on someone else to carry their feelings. The resistance to the sensitive person's boundaries is often proportional to the degree of unconsciousness that those boundaries threaten to expose. The conscious sensitive must learn to navigate this resistance with compassion, but without compromise. They must develop the capacity to understand others' discomfort with their transformation, while refusing to abandon their development to relieve that discomfort. They must find ways to communicate their boundaries that honor both their own needs and others' humanity without sacrificing either for the sake of peace. This navigation requires what I call diplomatic firmness, the ability to be absolutely clear about one's limits while remaining kind and respectful in their communication. It means saying no with love, setting boundaries with grace, disappointing others with integrity. It requires the sensitive individual to develop skills they may never have needed when they were unconsciously accommodating. The ability to tolerate others' disappointment, to maintain their position in the face of pressure, to choose their own well-being even when others disagree with that choice. Learning these skills can feel like learning a foreign language. The sensitive person who has spent their life reading others' needs and adjusting accordingly must now learn to read their own needs and communicate them clearly. They must develop comfort with being misunderstood, with being accused of selfishness, with being seen as difficult or demanding by people who were comfortable with their previous self-effacement. But mastering this diplomatic firmness becomes one of the most valuable gifts the conscious sensitive can offer to the world. By modeling healthy boundaries, they give others permission to develop their own. By refusing to enable unconscious dependence, they create space for genuine, mutual relationship. By choosing themselves without abandoning others, they demonstrate that these seemingly opposite impulses can coexist. The ripple effects of this modeling extend far beyond the sensitive individual's immediate relationships. Their children learn that care can coexist with boundaries, that love does not require self-sacrifice, that service can emerge from strength rather than depletion. Their partners discover their own capacity to carry their emotional experience rather than depending on someone else to manage it for them. Their communities begin to develop new norms around mutual support that honor everyone's autonomy while maintaining connection. I have watched entire families transform when one sensitive member learns to embody conscious boundaries. The family member who had been the designated emotional regulator suddenly stops absorbing everyone else's chaos, creating a vacuum that forces others to develop their own emotional skills. Initially, this can create temporary turbulence as family patterns reorganize around new realities. But gradually, a healthier dynamic emerges in which each person takes responsibility for their own emotional life while remaining available for genuine mutual support. The transformation is particularly profound for children in such families. Instead of learning that love requires self-abandonment, they observe adults who can care deeply while maintaining their own integrity. Instead of absorbing unconscious messages about sacrifice and martyrdom, they witness examples of service that emerges from fullness rather than emptiness. Instead of developing their own patterns of unconscious absorption, they learn skills for maintaining healthy boundaries while remaining open-hearted. This intergenerational healing represents one of the most significant gifts the conscious sensitive can offer. By breaking their own patterns of unconscious absorption, they interrupt cycles that might otherwise continue for generations. Their healing becomes not just personal, but ancestral, affecting not only their own lives, but the lives of those who come after them. The process of conscious sensitivity development often reveals connections to ancestral patterns that extend far beyond individual psychology. Many sensitive individuals discover that their gift carries within it the unprocessed emotional material of their lineage, that they have inherited not just genetic material, but psychic material from previous generations. Working with these ancestral patterns requires expanding beyond individual therapy to include what might be called family systems, work at the soul level. The sensitive individual must learn to distinguish between their own authentic emotional responses and the ghostly echoes of ancestral wounds that speak through them. They must develop capacity to honor their inheritance without being enslaved by it, to feel the pain of their lineage without taking responsibility for healing it. This ancestral dimension often emerges in dreams and visions that contain symbols, settings, and characters from family history. The sensitive individual may find themselves reliving experiences that belong to grandparents they never met, carrying grief from losses that occurred before their birth, expressing anger about injustices they never personally experienced. These ancestral intrusions are not pathological, they are informational. They reveal the ways in which unprocessed material seeks expression through sensitive descendants, the ways in which family systems attempt to heal themselves through individuals willing to feel what others could not. But recognition of this dynamic allows the sensitive person to engage with ancestral material consciously rather than being unconsciously possessed by it. I worked with a man whose sensitivity seemed to carry within it the unprocessed trauma of his grandfather's experience in war. He would have nightmares about battles he had never fought, panic attacks triggered by sounds that reminded him of artillery, and periods of depression that seemed to descend without personal cause. Through our exploration, he learned to distinguish between his own emotional responses and the ancestral material that sought expression through his sensitivity. The healing process involved creating conscious connection with his grandfather's experience without taking it on as his own. He learned to honor the trauma without absorbing it, to witness the pain without carrying it, to acknowledge the sacrifice without inheriting the burden. This work freed him from unconscious possession by ancestral material while allowing him to maintain conscious connection with his family's history. This kind of ancestral healing work represents a sophisticated application of conscious sensitivity. It requires the individual to develop the capacity to feel across time, to witness experiences that occurred in different generations, to serve as a bridge between past and present without losing their own temporal grounding. It demands skills that go far beyond individual emotional regulation to include what might be called transpersonal therapeutic capacity. The sensitive individual who develops these skills often finds themselves naturally drawn to forms of service that address collective as well as individual healing. They may become therapists who specialize in family systems work, artists who give voice to collective experiences, teachers who help others develop their own sensitivity consciously, or healers who work with the energetic patterns that connect individuals to larger wholes. But this calling to transpersonal service must emerge from conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. The difference between authentic spiritual service and unconscious absorption can be subtle, but it is crucial. Authentic service arises from recognition of one's gifts and conscious choice to offer them. Unconscious absorption occurs when unhealed wounds drive the person to take on more than they can consciously handle. The conscious sensitive learns to distinguish between these two motivations through careful attention to their internal experience. Authentic service feels energizing even when it is challenging. It arises from love rather than fear, from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion. Unconscious absorption feels draining, desperate, driven by anxiety about what might happen if the person does not intervene. Learning to recognize these internal distinctions allows the sensitive individual to serve at the level that matches their actual capacity rather than their unconscious compulsions. They can offer their gifts powerfully without overwhelming themselves, deeply without losing themselves, consistently without depleting themselves. This mastery represents the culmination of the conscious sensitivity development process. The individual has learned to navigate their gift skillfully, to offer it consciously, to protect it wisely. They have transformed what once felt like a burden into a refined instrument of service. They have discovered that their sensitivity, when conscious, is not a liability, but an asset. Not a weakness, but a strength. Not a problem, but a solution to problems that unconscious individuals cannot even perceive. The world needs such individuals now more than ever. In an age of increasing complexity, rapid change, and collective trauma, the capacity for conscious sensitivity becomes not just personally valuable, but culturally essential. The problems facing humanity require individuals who can perceive subtle patterns, feel into complex dynamics, and respond from wisdom rather than reactivity. The conscious sensitive, trained through their own healing journey to navigate complexity without being overwhelmed by it, possesses exactly the skills needed for these challenges. They can feel the pain of the world without being paralyzed by it, perceive the interconnections that others miss without losing their own grounding, respond to collective needs without abandoning their individual well-being. But this service can only be offered from a foundation of conscious development. The unconscious sensitive, overwhelmed by their own absorption patterns, cannot serve collective healing because they cannot distinguish between their own needs and collective needs, their own wounds and collective wounds, their own healing and collective healing. This is why the journey I have described is not ultimately personal, but transpersonal, not just individual, but collective. Every sensitive individual who undertakes the work of conscious development contributes not only to their own healing, but to the healing of the larger systems of which they are part. Their transformation creates ripple effects that extend far beyond their personal lives to touch families, communities, cultures, and ultimately the entire human collective. The path is neither easy nor quick. It requires courage to face what has been avoided, patience to develop new capacities, and commitment to choose consciousness repeatedly, even when unconsciousness seems easier. It demands that the sensitive individual become both student and teacher, both healer and patient, both servant and sovereign. But for those willing to undertake this journey, the rewards extend far beyond personal well-being. They discover that their sensitivity, when conscious, becomes a doorway to dimensions of experience and service that unconscious absorption could never access. They find that their refined awareness becomes a gift not only to themselves, but to everyone whose life they touch. In learning to honor their sensitivity without being enslaved by it, they discover they have not lost their gift, but transformed it into something far more powerful, the capacity to serve life itself through conscious expression of their deepest nature. And in that service they find not only healing for themselves, but hope for a world that desperately needs the gifts that conscious sensitivity can offer. The choice is yours. You can continue on the familiar path of unconscious absorption, serving others at the expense of yourself, carrying burdens that were never yours to bear, slowly dissolving into the needs and expectations of everyone around you. Or you can choose the more difficult but infinitely more rewarding path of conscious development, learning to honor your gift without being consumed by it, discovering that true service emerges not from self-sacrifice, but from self-realization. The world is waiting for your choice. Not the world of those who would consume your energy without gratitude, but the world that needs what only conscious sensitivity can provide. The capacity to feel deeply while thinking clearly, to care profoundly while remaining whole, to serve powerfully while staying true to your essential nature. Your sensitivity is not your curse, it is your calling. But only you can transform it from unconscious burden to conscious gift, from source of suffering to instrument of service, from liability to legacy. The choice begins now, in this moment, with the simple recognition that another way is possible. Everything else follows from that recognition, step by conscious step, choice by conscious choice, until what once felt like betrayal becomes the deepest form of fidelity. Fidelity to your own soul, and through that fidelity, service to the soul of the world.